Berlin, April the 16th, 1945. 4 o'clock in the morning, and the sky over the River Oder turns white. Not with dawn, but with light manufactured by human hands on a scale never before attempted in warfare. 143 anti-aircraft searchlights, spaced roughly 200 meters apart along a 30-kilometre stretch of the Seelow Heights, snap on in unison, throwing beams across no man's land to blind the German defenders crouched in their trenches. Behind the lights, more than 8,000 artillery pieces begin to fire at once, a barrage so dense that soldiers standing near the guns would later describe the ground itself as trembling like the skin of a drum. Somewhere in the chaos, a young Red Army lieutenant presses himself flat against the cold earth of an assault trench, waiting for the order to advance towards a city that, in his mind, exists only as a name from newsreels and propaganda posters. He does not yet know it, but he is about to take part in the final act of the deadliest conflict in human history, the assault that will end the Third Reich and place a red flag above the Reichstag within a fortnight. This single morning, with its manufactured dawn and its earth-shaking barrage, marks the opening of the Battle of Berlin, and it matters because what happened over the next 16 days would settle not just the fate of Germany, but the shape of Europe for the next half-century. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was a state collapsing under its own weight, yet Berlin itself remained, on paper, a formidable objective. The city sat behind two major water obstacles, the Oder and the Neisse, and the approach across the Seelow Heights offered the Germans a natural defensive ridge overlooking flat, marshy ground that any attacking force would have to cross in full view of prepared positions. General Gotthard Heinrici, who had built a reputation as one of the Wehrmacht's most capable defensive commanders, had spent weeks constructing a defense in depth, with 3 successive lines of trenches, minefields, and anti-tank ditches designed to absorb and bleed dry any Soviet assault. He understood that Stalin wanted Berlin quickly, for reasons that were as much political as military, and he gambled that a slow, grinding defense could inflict such catastrophic casualties that the Soviet advance would stall. The problem facing the Red Army commanders, Marshals Georgy Zhukov, Ivan Konev, and Konstantin Rokossovsky, was therefore not simply how to defeat the German army in the field, since by this point the Wehrmacht was chronically short of fuel, ammunition, and experienced men, but how to break through a fortified position quickly enough to seize the German capital before the Western Allies could reach it, and before the fighting degenerated into a prolonged, costly siege of a city that had been transformed into a fortress of rubble, tank traps, and fanatical last-ditch defenders drawn from the Volkssturm and the Hitler Youth. Existing Soviet doctrine, built around massed infantry and armor assaults, had proven devastatingly effective on the open steppes of the Eastern Front, but Berlin presented a different kind of battlefield altogether, one of cellars, sewers, and shattered apartment blocks, where a single anti-tank weapon in the hands of a teenager could destroy a multi-million-ruble tank in seconds. Soviet planners had to solve, in effect, 2 separate problems at once: how to smash through a well-prepared field defense on the Oder, and then how to fight and win an urban battle inside a city of over 4 million people, much of it already reduced to ruins by years of Allied bombing. There was also a political clock ticking that no amount of engineering could slow. Stalin had grown increasingly convinced, rightly or wrongly, that Churchill in particular harbored ambitions of reaching Berlin before the Red Army, and he was determined not to allow the political prize of the German capital to slip from Soviet hands after 4 years of catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. Losses that by some estimates ran into the tens of millions when military and civilian deaths were combined. This suspicion, whether fully justified or not, injected a note of urgency into Soviet planning that went well beyond ordinary military caution, and it partly explains why Zhukov and Konev were encouraged, and in some tellings actively pushed by Stalin, into a degree of rivalry over which of their 2 fronts would be first to reach the center of the city, a competition that some historians argue contributed to unnecessary casualties as units pressed forward without always waiting for adequate reconnaissance or artillery preparation. Compounding the difficulty further was the sheer unpredictability of what awaited Soviet forces once they entered the city itself. Aerial reconnaissance could reveal the outline of streets and the shells of buildings, but it could not show which cellars had been reinforced into strongpoints, which sewers had been mined, or which apparently abandoned apartment blocks concealed a handful of determined defenders with a clear field of fire down a boulevard. Earlier fighting on the Eastern Front, particularly the brutal house-to-house battles at Stalingrad in 1942 and 1943, had taught both sides bitter lessons about the cost of underestimating urban terrain, yet Berlin was larger, denser, and more heavily fortified than Stalingrad had ever been. Ringed by 3 concentric defensive sectors designated by the Germans themselves and studded with anti-aircraft towers whose thick concrete walls could shrug off all but the heaviest artillery fire. In short, the Red Army faced a problem with no clean precedent: an enemy capital, defended by a chaotic mixture of battle-hardened SS units, exhausted regular soldiers, and barely trained civilians, all fighting with the particular desperation of men and boys who believed, not without reason, that defeat meant annihilation rather than mere surrender. The Soviet answer to this challenge was built at a scale that dwarfed almost anything seen in the war up to that point, and it was assembled not by a single design bureau, but by the entire logistical machinery of the Soviet state, marshaled by the General Staff in Moscow and coordinated through the headquarters of the First Belarusian and First Ukrainian fronts. Roughly 2.5 million Soviet and Polish troops were committed to the operation, supported by more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns and over 7,000 aircraft, figures that made the Berlin operation one of the largest single military undertakings in history. At the heart of the technical solution lay the sheer concentration of artillery, with planners aiming for a density of firepower that some sectors saw exceed 250 guns per kilometer of front, a figure so extreme that ammunition supply alone required tens of thousands of lorries operating around the clock. The searchlights, an idea championed by Marshal Zhukov personally, were intended to blind and disorient the German defenders while illuminating the battlefield for the advancing Soviet troops, though in practice the results were mixed, since the light, filtered through the dust and smoke thrown up by the barrage, sometimes did as much to silhouette the attackers as to blind the defenders. For the urban fighting that followed, Soviet forces adapted a tactic first refined at Stalingrad, organizing infantry, engineers, and tanks into small, self-contained assault groups, typically built around a platoon of infantry, a section of combat engineers carrying satchel charges and flamethrowers, and 1 or 2 tanks or self-propelled guns for direct fire support. These groups would clear buildings one room at a time, often blasting through internal walls with explosives rather than exposing themselves in doorways and stairwells, a method German soldiers grimly nicknamed mouse-holing. The heavy IS-2 tank, weighing around 46 tons and armed with a 122mm gun originally designed for coastal defense, proved particularly effective in this role. Capable of demolishing a fortified building with 2 or 3 rounds, its shell impact sometimes compared by witnesses to the sound of a goods train derailing at close range. Alongside the tanks came the Katyusha rocket launchers, mounted on lorry chassis and capable of firing salvos of unguided rockets that saturated an area with explosive force in seconds, their distinctive howling shriek earning them the nickname Stalin's organ from terrified German troops. Soviet industry, evacuated beyond the Urals earlier in the war and rebuilt at extraordinary speed, had by this stage reached production levels that Germany simply could not match, turning out thousands of tanks and artillery pieces a month from factories in Chelyabinsk, Nizhny Tagil, and elsewhere, though exact production figures for specific weeks in early 1945 remain difficult to verify precisely, since wartime Soviet record-keeping prioritized speed over accuracy, and many archives remained closed to Western historians for decades after the war. The fighting that followed the initial assault on the Seelow Heights was ferocious and costly, taking nearly 4 days rather than the swift breakthrough Zhukov had envisaged. as German defenders used the ridge's terrain to inflict heavy losses on the advancing Soviet armor. Once the heights fell, however, the advance into Berlin itself accelerated rapidly, with Soviet spearheads reaching the city's eastern suburbs by April the 21st. Inside the city, the fighting described by veterans and civilians alike had a nightmarish, claustrophobic quality, entirely unlike the open maneuver warfare of earlier campaigns. Assault groups fought their way down streets like the Frankfurter Allee and towards the government quarter around the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery, often taking days to cross distances that might normally be walked in minutes, as every basement, sewer entrance, and pile of rubble could conceal a defender armed with a Panzerfaust, the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that proved lethally effective against Soviet armor in the confined streets. Survivors' accounts describe a city transformed into something almost lunar, thick with dust and smoke that turned daylight into perpetual twilight, punctuated by the constant crack of small arms fire and the deeper thud of artillery. The psychological effect on the remaining German defenders, many of them elderly Volkssturm militiamen or boys as young as 12 or 13 drafted from the Hitler Youth, was profound, with numerous accounts describing mass surrenders once resistance in a given block collapsed, even as isolated fanatics fought on in cellars until the very end. Precise casualty figures for the urban phase remain contested among historians even today, with Soviet losses for the entire Berlin operation estimated at over 80,000 dead, though the breakdown between the Seelow battle and the subsequent street fighting is not always cleanly recorded in surviving documentation. Some of the fiercest fighting of the entire operation took place around the Reichstag itself in the final days of April, a building that had stood as a burnt-out shell since a suspicious fire in 1933, but which Soviet commanders, for reasons more symbolic than strategic, treated as the ultimate prize of the campaign, believing it to be the seat of German government rather than the largely ceremonial building it had actually become. German defenders, including a mixture of SS troops, naval cadets, and Volkssturm militia, turned the surrounding Königsplatz into a killing ground, and Soviet accounts describe repeated assaults across open ground beaten by machine gun and artillery fire before troops finally fought their way inside on April 30th, after which the battle continued, room by room and floor by floor, for a further 2 days even as the swastika flag was replaced above the building. Elsewhere in the city, the fighting took on a grimmer, more intimate character within the government quarter around the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler's personal guard, drawn largely from SS units, fought with a fanaticism that contrasted sharply with the mass surrenders occurring simultaneously in other districts, a divergence that illustrates how unevenly resistance was distributed across the collapsing city. Soviet soldiers advancing through residential areas further from the government quarter frequently encountered a very different Berlin, one of white sheets hung from windows as makeshift surrender flags, and terrified civilians emerging from cellars that had sheltered them for days without food or clean water, and it is from this period that some of the war's most troubling and least comfortable historical records emerge, concerning the treatment of German civilians by occupying Soviet troops, a subject that remained largely absent from official Soviet accounts for decades and continues to be the subject of careful historical research and debate. What is beyond dispute is the sheer disorientation experienced by those caught inside the collapsing city, German and Soviet alike, as the normal markers of time and space dissolved into an unbroken cycle of explosions, collapsing masonry, and the acrid smell of burning that veterans on both sides would recall for the rest of their lives. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is worth pausing to compare the Soviet approach to Berlin with what German and Western Allied forces attempted elsewhere in this final phase of the war. The Germans themselves had, ironically, pioneered many of the underlying urban warfare techniques the Soviets now turned against them, developed during the brutal defense and later the doomed offensive at Stalingrad, where small storm groups first proved their worth in ruined cityscapes. Yet by 1945, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to field anything comparable to the mass of Soviet armor deployed at Berlin. German tank production, though technically sophisticated in designs like the Tiger II, never approached Soviet output, and by this stage of the war, fuel shortages left many German armored vehicles immobilized long before they could be committed to battle. On the Western Front, American and British forces had faced their own bitter urban fighting, notably at Aachen in October 1944, the first major German city to fall to the Western Allies, where American forces used tactics broadly similar. In spirit, if smaller in scale, combining infantry, tanks, and engineers to clear the city block by block over roughly a week of fighting. However, the Western Allies deliberately chose not to race for Berlin itself, a decision made at the highest political level by General Eisenhower and endorsed with reservations by Churchill and Roosevelt, on the calculation that the city lay well within the zone, already agreed for Soviet occupation, and that an Allied assault would cost tens of thousands of Western lives to capture a prize that would then have to be handed over regardless. This decision left the terrible arithmetic of Berlin's capture to the Red Army alone, and it is this scale of sacrifice, both inflicted and endured, that distinguishes the Soviet operation from anything attempted by the Western Allies in the war's final year. Where German defensive doctrine relied on skill and desperation to compensate for dwindling resources, and where American and British forces generally sought to minimize casualties through overwhelming firepower and careful maneuver, the Soviet approach to Berlin accepted extraordinarily high losses as the price of political urgency, a calculation shaped as much by Stalin's determination to reach the German capital before his Western allies as by any purely military logic. The impact of the Battle of Berlin extended far beyond the immediate military outcome of the war's final days. Militarily, the operation demonstrated conclusively that mass, concentrated firepower combined with adapted, small-unit urban tactics could overcome even a well-prepared defense inside a major city, lessons that would influence Soviet military thinking for decades, and that some historians argue also shaped later Western doctrine on urban combat, though the human cost involved made it a template few armies would wish to replicate deliberately. Psychologically, the fall of Berlin shattered whatever remained of German civilian and military morale, and the images of the Red Army flag raised over the Reichstag on April 30, 1945, hours after Hitler's suicide in the Führerbunker beneath the ruined Chancellery Garden, became one of the defining images of the entire war, endlessly reproduced, and, as later research revealed, in at least one famous photograph, staged and retouched for propaganda purposes rather than captured in the precise instant it purported to show. Politically, the fact that Soviet rather than Western forces captured the German capital fundamentally shaped the post-war division of Europe, giving Stalin both the practical control of the city, later divided into occupation sectors, and the symbolic authority of having delivered the decisive military blow against Nazism, a narrative that would underpin Soviet propaganda throughout the Cold War. Surviving physical evidence of the battle can still be found scattered across Berlin today, from shrapnel scars and bullet pockmarks preserved on buildings like the Reichstag itself and the Pergamon Museum, to the vast Soviet War Memorial in Treptower Park, built partly from marble salvaged from Hitler's demolished chancellery, standing as a permanent, almost defiant monument to the scale of Soviet sacrifice. The precise number of civilian deaths within Berlin during the battle remains genuinely uncertain, with estimates ranging widely depending on the source and methodology used, a reminder that even an event as thoroughly documented as the fall of a major European capital retains gaps that historians continue to argue over 8 decades later. Return, for a moment, to that lieutenant pressed flat in the mud on the morning of April 16th, watching 143 searchlights burn holes in the darkness above the Seelow Heights. He could not have known in that instant that he was witnessing the opening moments of an operation that would end, 16 days later, with a red flag snapping in the wind above a gutted Parliament building, nor that the city he was about to fight his way through, street by shattered street, would become the physical fault line of a divided continent for the next 45 years. What the Soviet forces achieved in Berlin was, by any measure, staggering in both its scale and its brutality. A city of 4 million people reduced to rubble in a matter of weeks, an army of over 2.5 million men thrown against a crumbling but still lethal defense, and a victory purchased at a cost in Soviet lives that would have been politically unthinkable for any Western democracy to accept. It was industrial power married to improvised tactics, searchlights and satchel charges, heavy tanks and Stalin's organs, all bent towards a single overriding purpose: the destruction of a regime that had, over the preceding 4 years, inflicted unimaginable suffering across the Soviet Union and the whole of Europe. The Battle of Berlin did not simply end the war in Europe. It wrote in the rubble of the Reichstag and the ruins of the Chancellery Garden the opening terms of the peace that followed, terms that would harden within years into the Iron Curtain and the long, cold standoff of the decades to come. Soldiers advanced through smoke that never seemed to clear. Civilians huddled in cellars that offered only the illusion of safety. And somewhere beneath it all, in a bunker that no searchlight could reach, the architect of it all took his own life rather than face the reckoning his armies had made inevitable. Berlin fell in 16 days. Europe would spend the next 45 years living with the consequences.